For 2 years, I paid my father's $88,000 in medical bills, while my brother strutted around treating our family business like his personal piggy bank. He actually laughed at the dilapidated old house our dad left me. But the laughter completely died the day the lawyer opened the will, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "You missed one clause. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 31 years old, and I work as a corporate payroll specialist. Before I tell you exactly how I took back what was mine and taught my arrogant brother a lesson he will never forget, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I only ask that you do this if you genuinely connect with this story. Also, I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Drop a comment below. I love reading your responses. Now let me take you back to the exact moment my entire reality began to crack. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on a freezing Tuesday in November. I was sitting alone at my cramped kitchen table surrounded by a mountain of paperwork. The only light in the room came from a single bulb hanging overhead, casting harsh shadows across the stack of envelopes. Every single envelope bore the same terrifying red ink. Final notice. Immediate action required. Account sent to collections. I stared at the numbers until my vision blurred. Palliative care facility fees. Specialized respiratory medications. Rental costs for industrial oxygen tanks. Round-the-clock nursing assistance. The balance at the bottom of the master ledger I had created was staggering. I had spent exactly $88,000 over the past 2 years keeping our father alive and comfortable. My father, Thomas Jenkins, was a proud man. He had built Jenkins Regional Logistics from absolutely nothing. He started with one used delivery truck and a clipboard working 18-hour days to ensure his family never went hungry. I grew up watching him sacrifice his body and his youth for that company. Now he was lying in a sterile hospice bed on the other side of town, his body failing his memory, fading completely unaware of the financial ruin threatening to pull the rug out from under his final days. I rubbed my burning eyes, feeling the sheer weight of exhaustion pressing down on my shoulders. As a corporate payroll specialist, my days were spent meticulously managing multi-million-dollar payroll accounts for a massive software firm. I worked 50 to 60 hours a week, ensuring thousands of employees were compensated accurately and on time. But my own financial life was unraveling. Every paycheck I earned went straight into the black hole of my father's medical expenses. I had given up my apartment downtown and moved into a cheap studio in the suburbs, just to afford the gas to drive to the hospice center every evening. I ate instant noodles for dinner. I wore shoes with worn-out soles. I gave up everything because that is what you do for the people who raised you. But I was drowning. The latest bill from the hospice care center was for $12,000, and it was due by Friday. If I did not pay it, they would discharge him. They would legally evict a dying man. I picked up my phone. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock the screen. I did not want to make this call. I dreaded this call more than anything else in the world, but I had absolutely no choice left. I had to call my older brother. Bradley was 34 years old. While I had inherited my father's quiet work ethic and tendency to put my head down and grind, Bradley had inherited my mother's flair for the dramatic and a terrifying sense of entitlement. When our father first got sick and had to step away from the daily operations of Jenkins Regional Logistics, he handed the keys to the kingdom directly to Bradley. Dad thought he was ensuring the legacy would continue. Instead, he gave my brother a blank check to fund his wildest delusions of grandeur. I hit the call button and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone echo in the silent kitchen. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. I prayed he would answer. I prayed he would finally step up and be the son our father deserved. "Please pick up," I whispered to the empty room. My stomach was tied in knots. Growing up, Bradley and I were never close. He was the golden boy, the high school quarterback, the business major who charmed everyone in the room. I was the quiet numbers girl in the background. Whenever our parents had money to spare, it went to Bradley's lacrosse camps, Bradley's fraternity dues, Bradley's graduation trips. I paid my own way through state college by working the night shift at a diner. I never complained. I simply accepted my role as the dependable, invisible daughter. But this was not about me. This was about our father. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I rehearsed the words in my head. I planned to be calm, rational, and strictly focused on the math. Bradley understood math. He ran a logistics company after all. Surely, when he saw the itemized invoices, when he understood the imminent threat of Dad being removed from the care facility, he would authorize a disbursement from the company accounts. The business generated millions in revenue annually. A fraction of that could save our father's dignity. On the fifth ring, the line clicked open. Immediately, a wall of sound blasted through the speaker. I heard the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, the low thumping bass of live jazz music, and a chorus of loud, arrogant laughter. "Yeah, what is it?" Bradley barked into the phone. He sounded annoyed, distracted, and completely out of breath. "Bradley." "It is, Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry to call so late, but it is an emergency." "Sarah." "I am at the country club," he sighed loudly, making sure I knew exactly how inconvenient my existence was to him. "We are celebrating a massive contract renewal. Chloe and I are hosting the executives from the new supply chain firm. Make it quick. I have people waiting on me." I closed my eyes and gripped the edge of the kitchen table. Chloe was his wife. She drove a brand new $90,000 luxury SUV that Bradley had bought her for their anniversary just 2 months ago. They lived in a gated community, took vacations to the Amalfi Coast, and posted photos of their imported caviar dinners online. Meanwhile, I was staring at a pile of past due notices for the man who gave Bradley everything. "Dad's medical bills are completely out of control, Bradley," I said, forcing myself to speak clearly and plainly. "The hospice facility just issued a final notice. We owe them $12,000 by Friday, and there is another $20,000 in accumulated debt for his respiratory therapy. I have drained my savings. I have nothing left. We need to pull money from the business to cover his care." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The jazz music swelled in the background. Then Bradley let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Sarah, are you listening to yourself?" he said, his tone dripping with patronizing superiority. "You do not just pull money from a corporate entity. Jenkins Regional Logistics is completely illiquid right now." "Illiquid," I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Bradley, you are posting record quarterly profits. I see the industry reports. You just bought Chloe a Porsche." "That is a corporate lease, Sarah." He shot back, his voice hardening with irritation. "It is a business write-off. You really do not understand corporate finance at all, do you? Every single dollar of our capital is tied up in fleet upgrades, aggressive marketing campaigns, and regional expansion. I cannot just liquidate operational funds because you panicked over a hospital bill." "I am not panicking," I pleaded, feeling hot tears prick the corners of my eyes. "They are going to kick him out, Bradley. They are going to put our dying father on the street. I cannot pay this. I literally do not have the cash." "Well, maybe you need to budget better," he said smoothly. The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Budget better. I was wearing a sweater with a hole in the sleeve, sitting in an unheated apartment, and he was telling me to budget better from a luxury country club. "Budget better," I gasped. "I do not buy anything. I do not go anywhere. I work and I pay for Dad. That is my entire life. Look, I am sorry it is stressful for you," Bradley continued, utilizing that fake sympathetic voice he used when dealing with unhappy clients. "But I have a business to run. Dad trusted me to grow this company, and I'm honoring his legacy by focusing on the bottom line. You are the one who insisted on putting him in that high-end facility. You chose to take on that burden. Do not try to guilt-trip me into bankrupting the company just because you cannot manage your personal finances." Before I could even formulate a response, I heard Chloe's voice in the background, sharp and nasal. "Bradley, the sommelier, is waiting to pour the vintage reserve. Tell your sister you have to go." "I have to go," Sarah, Bradley said. "Just figure it out. You are a smart girl. Cut back on the expensive coffees or something. I will call you next week." The line went dead. I sat there listening to the absolute silence of my kitchen. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the table. I could not breathe. I could not think. I just stared at the red letters on the hospice bill. Final notice. He was not going to help. He was never going to help. Bradley was entirely content to let our father waste away to let me drown in crippling debt, as long as his country club memberships and luxury car leases were secure. He had taken the family legacy, the business our father built with his own 2 hands, and walled it off, keeping the profits for himself, and leaving me with the agonizing responsibility of keeping our father alive. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. There was no time for crying. Crying did not pay the bills. Crying did not buy oxygen tanks or secure a bed in a medical facility. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room. I pulled up my browser and navigated to my Fidelity Investments portal. I typed in my password, my fingers moving mechanically, completely detached from the devastating reality of what I was about to do. I clicked on my retirement portfolio. It was my 401k account. I had started contributing to it the very first day I landed my corporate payroll job. I had diligently put away a percentage of every paycheck, planning for a future, planning for a small house, planning for a family I hope to have one day. The balance sat there, a testament to years of financial discipline and hard work. I clicked the button that said, "Liquidate Assets." A warning screen popped up advising me of the severe early withdrawal penalties. It warned me of the massive tax implications. It explicitly told me I was about to wipe out my entire financial future. I did not even blink. I checked the box, confirming I understood the risks. I authorized the full withdrawal. With one single click, my entire future was erased. Every late night, every skipped vacation, every penny I had saved for the last 10 years vanished into a transfer queue destined to cover the $88,000 in debt my brother refused to acknowledge. The conflict was permanently set. The battle lines were drawn. I had given absolutely everything I had, stripping myself down to nothing just to do the right thing. Bradley had taken absolutely everything, hoarding wealth and status while abandoning his own flesh and blood. I did not know it yet, sitting in that cold, dark kitchen, but that massive, heartbreaking sacrifice was exactly what would eventually give me the ultimate power to destroy his perfectly curated life. The weeks following the liquidation of my retirement account were a blur of sheer survival. I was running on empty, fueled by nothing but stale office coffee and the raw terror of absolute financial ruin. When you drain your retirement fund, the money does not just magically appear. You have to wait for the processing watch, the massive tax penalties slice away your hard-earned security, and then immediately wire those funds to the collections department of a medical facility. I had spent 10 years building a safety net. It vanished in exactly 3 business days. To compensate, I took on every extra hour of overtime my firm would legally allow. My alarm went off at 4 in the morning. I sat at my desk until 8 at night. My eyes burned from staring at complex payroll spreadsheets, verifying massive corporate bonuses for executives, while I was quietly calculating how many meals I could stretch out of a $5 bag of rice. My hands were constantly shaking, a low-level tremor born of chronic sleep deprivation and pure unadulterated stress. The worst part was the absolute isolation. I could not tell my coworkers that their senior payroll specialist was essentially bankrupt. I could not tell my father because his heart condition and failing lungs could not handle the stress of knowing he was a financial burden. I carried the weight entirely alone. Meanwhile, Bradley was living a completely different reality. As the newly self-appointed Chief Executive Officer of Jenkins Regional Logistics, he treated our father's company like his own personal kingdom. I saw the signs, but I was too exhausted to fight him on the daily excesses. Until the family dinner on the first Sunday of December. My Aunt Martha had organized a modest get-together at a local diner, hoping to lift our spirits as the holidays approached. She insisted we all attend. I drove my 12-year-old sedan across town. The heater was broken and the transmission shuddered every time I shifted gears. I parked near the back of the lot, wrapping my worn wool coat tightly around myself to block out the biting winter wind. As I walked toward the diner entrance, a vehicle pulled into the lot, completely demanding the attention of everyone nearby. It was a brand new custom-ordered luxury sports utility vehicle. The paint was a flawless mirror finish midnight blue. The chrome detailing gleamed under the streetlights. It slid into the premier parking spot right by the front door, the engine letting out a low, powerful purr before shutting off. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, forming a white cloud in the freezing air. The driver's side door opened and Bradley stepped out. He was wearing a tailored cashmere overcoat and a designer watch that caught the light. He walked around the front of the vehicle, smiling like he had just conquered the world, and opened the passenger door. Chloe stepped out, laughing, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. She was holding a luxury designer handbag that cost more than my rent. I stood perfectly still, my feet frozen to the icy pavement. The mathematical part of my brain, the part that investigated financial discrepancies for a living, immediately calculated the sticker price of that vehicle. $90,000. Minimum. With custom upgrades, probably closer to $110,000. $90,000. I had just incinerated my entire life savings, exactly $88,000, to keep the man who gave Bradley that company alive. And my brother had taken the equivalent amount of cash and purchased a German luxury car for his wife. A wave of nausea washed over me. The stark, undeniable contrast between my reality and theirs was sickening. I felt the sharp sting of betrayal twisting in my gut. I did not walk into the diner. I marched straight toward them, my scuffed boots hitting the pavement with heavy, deliberate steps. "Bradley," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the cold air. He turned completely unbothered, his arrogant smile firmly in place. "Sarah, look who finally made it out of her cubicle. What do you think of Chloe's new ride and early Christmas present? She deserves it." I stared at the gleaming hood of the sports utility vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. "You bought a $90,000 car," I stated, fighting to keep my voice from completely shattering. "You told me 3 weeks ago that the company was illiquid. You told me you could not spare a single dime to stop the hospice facility from throwing our father out onto the street." Bradley sighed, an exaggerated theatrical sound of supreme impatience. He rolled his eyes and glanced at Chloe, sharing a look of shared annoyance. "Here we go again," he muttered, shaking his head. "Sarah, we already had this conversation. I am not going to let you ruin a nice family dinner with your financial paranoia." Financial paranoia. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I liquidated my retirement account, Bradley. I drained every single cent I had to my name to pay Dad's medical debt, because you claimed the business was completely tied up in regional expansion, and you used company funds to buy a luxury vehicle." Bradley adjusted his cashmere coat, standing taller, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. "It is a business write-off, Sarah," he said, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. "The vehicle is technically owned by Jenkins Regional Logistics. It is a company car. We use it for client dinners. It reduces our taxable income liability at the end of the fiscal year. You really would not understand corporate finance. It is highly complex level strategy." I stared at him, absolutely stunned by his sheer staggering ignorance. I was a senior corporate payroll specialist. I managed the tax implications for multi-million-dollar corporate accounts. I knew exactly how asset depreciation and corporate tax write-offs functioned. You do not buy a luxury sports vehicle to reduce tax liability when your primary logistics fleet is aging, I fired back, my voice vibrating with suppressed rage. You do not use a corporate account to fund your wife's personal transportation when the founder of the company is currently on life support. That is not a corporate strategy, Bradley. That is embezzlement of family assets. Bradley's face darkened. The charming smile completely vanished, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. "Do not use words you do not understand, little sister," he snapped, stepping into my personal space. "I am the chief executive officer. Dad put me in charge. I make the executive decisions. If I determine that maintaining a high-level corporate image is essential for securing new logistics contracts, then I authorize the purchase. You sit at a desk and push buttons on a calculator all day. Do not presume to lecture me on how to run an empire. He actually called it an empire, a regional trucking company that our father built with blood and sweat, and Bradley was treating it like his own personal piggy bank. And what about Dad? I demanded, refusing to back down. Does his life fit into your executive decisions? Because you did not contribute a single dollar. You left me to shoulder an $88,000 burden completely alone. You chose to do that, Chloe chimed in. I shifted my gaze to my sister-in-law. She was leaning against the side of her new car, examining her freshly manicured nails with an air of complete boredom. Nobody forced you to drain your accounts, Sarah. Chloe continued, her voice high and deliberately sweet. Bradley offered to move Thomas into a state-funded facility, a much more affordable option, but you insisted on keeping him at that luxury hospice center. You wanted to play the hero. This is the consequence of your own financial mismanagement. A state-funded facility. They wanted to put a man who required round-the-clock specialized respiratory therapy into an understaffed, overwhelmed public ward simply because it would preserve Bradley's profit margins. He built the wealth that paid for that car, I told her, pointing a shaking finger at the shiny paint job. He worked 18-hour shifts so Bradley could go to private school. He deserves dignity in his final days. Chloe let out a soft, patronizing sigh. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning my appearance. She looked at my outdated wool coat, my unstyled hair, the dark, heavy circles under my eyes that no amount of cheap concealer could hide. A slow, cruel smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. You know, Sarah, you really look exhausted, Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. You are letting this stress completely ruin you. You look like you have aged 10 years in the last 6 months. Maybe if you focused a little more on your own life, you would not be so bitter about our success. The word hung in the freezing air. Bitter. They genuinely believed I was just a jealous, bitter spinster. They were not ignoring the catastrophic debt I had taken on. They were actively mocking my sacrifice. They viewed my dedication to our father as a pathetic flaw, a weakness they could exploit so they could continue to live like royalty without a single ounce of guilt. Bradley placed a protective arm around Chloe's waist. Let it go, babe. You cannot teach financial literacy to someone who insists on playing the martyr. Come on, Aunt Martha is waiting inside. He turned away from me, completely dismissing my presence, and escorted his wife toward the diner entrance. He did not look back once. He did not ask how Dad was doing today. He simply walked away, leaving me standing alone in the freezing parking lot next to a $90,000 monument to his overwhelming greed. I did not follow them inside. I could not sit at a table and break bread with people who viewed my total financial destruction as a minor inconvenience. I walked slowly back to my freezing ancient car. My hands were no longer shaking. The tears of desperation that had been threatening to spill over had completely dried up. Sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the worn steering wheel, a profound shift occurred deep within my mind. The desperate, pleading daughter who just wanted her older brother to do the right thing died in that parking lot. In her place, a cold, methodical corporate accountant woke up. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a spineless workhorse who would simply absorb the damage and fade into the background. Bradley had called me a button pusher. He had mocked my intelligence. He was absolutely convinced that his position as the self-appointed boss made him untouchable. But I knew something Bradley refused to understand. Corporate finance leaves a paper trail. Every single transaction, every single lease, every single transfer of wealth leaves an undeniable record. And nobody understands a paper trail better than the person who handles the corporate payroll. I put the car in gear and drove away from the diner, leaving my family behind. The emotional conflict was over. I was no longer begging for help. I was preparing for an audit. Winter had fully set in by the second week of December, bringing a brittle gray chill that seeped through the thin walls of my studio apartment and settled permanently into my bones. I was sitting at my cubicle at the software firm mechanically verifying a massive holiday bonus distribution for the executive team when my cell phone buzzed across the cheap laminate of my desk. The caller identification flashed the name of the hospice facility. My stomach instantly dropped into a bottomless freefall. I answered the phone with a trembling voice, and the head charge nurse delivered the news I had been dreading for months. My father had taken a drastic turn for the worse. His respiratory system was rapidly failing, and his body was rejecting the standard treatments. He had been moved to the acute end of life palliative care unit. The nurse told me I needed to come immediately. I grabbed my worn wool coat, abandoned my spreadsheets, and ran out of the office without saying a word to my supervisor. The drive to the facility was a blur of frantic prayers and blinding panic. When I finally sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the hospice center, the familiar smell of clinical antiseptic and stale floral air freshener hit me like a physical blow. Before I could even reach my father's room, a woman in a sharp gray suit stepped into my path. She was the financial administrator for the facility, a woman whose entire job consisted of squeezing money out of grieving families. She guided me into her sterile, windowless office and closed the door with a heavy click. She offered me a cup of lukewarm water and then slid a thick, itemized invoice across her polished desk. She explained in a perfectly modulated, sympathetic tone that my father's condition required a massive escalation in care. He needed continuous intravenous morphine, a dedicated round-the-clock respiratory specialist, and specialized life support machinery to ensure his final transition was absolutely painless. Then she dropped the ultimate financial hammer. Because his insurance benefits had been completely exhausted weeks ago, this new tier of acute palliative care required an immediate out-of-pocket lump sum payment to secure his room. If the funds were not deposited by the end of the business day, state regulations would force them to transfer him to a crowded, underfunded public county ward for his final hours. I stared at the number printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the page. $12,000. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. I had already liquidated my entire retirement account. I had canceled my health insurance. I had sold every piece of jewelry I owned that carried any real value. I was running on financial fumes, rationing rice and beans just to afford the gas to visit him. I had absolutely nothing left to give. I begged her for a payment plan. I offered to sign a promissory note pledging to garnish my own wages for the next 10 years. The administrator simply offered a tight, apologetic smile and tapped the paperwork. The facility policy was strictly inflexible regarding acute end-of-life care. The payment had to be rendered immediately. I walked out of her office and sank into a vinyl chair in the waiting room. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application. My checking account held exactly $42. But there was one final account I had deliberately refused to touch. It was a small emergency fund I had opened the day I graduated college, designed exclusively to keep me from ever ending up homeless if I lost my job. I had spent nearly a decade putting tiny amounts of money into it, skipping lunches and walking miles in the rain to save bus fare. It contained exactly $12,100. It was my absolute last line of defense against total ruin. If I drained it, I would have nothing between me and absolute poverty. I would be entirely destitute. I looked down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the room where my father was struggling for every single breath. I thought about the man who had worked double shifts loading heavy freight trucks in the freezing rain just to buy me a new winter coat when I was 7 years old. I thought about how he used to carry me on his shoulders when I was too tired to walk. I did not call Bradley. I knew exactly what my brother would say. He was probably sitting in his corner office right now planning his next luxury vacation while aggressively ignoring my existence. Calling him would only subject me to another degrading lecture about corporate asset management. I logged into the bank portal. I selected the emergency fund. I typed in $12,000 and routed the transfer directly to the facility's payment gateway. When the confirmation screen appeared showing a remaining balance of just over $100, I opened the master ledger on my phone. The meticulous spreadsheet where I had tracked every single medical expense for the past 2 years. I added the final $12,000 payment to the bottom of the column. The software instantly calculated the grand total of my personal expenditure. I stared at the bold numbers glowing on the screen. $88,000. I had spent exactly $88,000 keeping my father safe. I had burned my past, my present, and my entire financial future to the ground. I closed the application, shoved the phone deep into my coat pocket, and walked down the long hallway to be with my father. The acute palliative care room was heartbreakingly quiet, save for the rhythmic mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine and the slow, heavy beeping of the heart monitor. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow. I pulled a plastic chair close to the edge of the bed and sat down. My father looked so incredibly fragile. The man who had once hauled heavy steel logistics crates with his bare hands now seemed entirely swallowed up by the sterile white hospital blankets. His skin was pale and paper-thin, mapping a lifetime of brutal manual labor and exhaustion. I gently reached out and wrapped my hands around his right hand. His fingers were icy cold to the touch. I sat in that chair for hours perfectly still, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The winter sun slowly set outside the small window, casting long dark shadows across the linoleum floor. I did not cry. I had no tears left to shed. I just wanted to be there so he would not have to cross into the unknown completely alone. Around 9 o'clock at night, the rhythm of the machines began to change. The oxygen concentrator hissed with a different cadence and the heart monitor slowed to a sluggish, irregular beat. I leaned forward, gripping his hand a little tighter. Suddenly his breathing hitched. His eyelids fluttered heavy with exhaustion and morphine, and then slowly opened. For the past several days, his eyes had been clouded with pain and confusion, lost in the hazy fog of a failing mind. But in this singular moment, the fog completely lifted. His gaze was remarkably clear, sharp, and intensely focused. He turned his head slightly on the pillow and looked directly into my eyes. He did not look around the room. He did not scan the empty chairs near the door. He did not ask for Bradley. The golden boy, the son he had handed his entire multi-million-dollar empire to, was completely absent from his final thoughts. He looked only at me. "Sarah," he whispered. His voice was incredibly weak, sounding like dry leaves scraping against a window pane, but the determination behind the word was absolute. "I am here, Dad," I said, leaning closer, my face just inches from his. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." His grip on my hand suddenly tightened with a surprising surge of lingering strength. He swallowed hard, fighting past the dry rattle in his throat. "I saw what you did," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with a profound, piercing intensity. "I saw who showed up." A heavy lump formed in my throat. He knew. Despite the pain medications and the countless days of slipping in and out of consciousness, he had recognized every single sacrifice. He knew I was the one sleeping in the plastic chairs, arguing with billing departments, and holding his hand through the darkest hours of the night. I wanted to tell him it was okay. I wanted to tell him not to worry about the money or the debt or the brother who had abandoned us both. But before I could form the words, his expression shifted. The gentle gratitude in his eyes transformed into something urgent, something fiercely protective and incredibly calculated. "The old house on Maple Street," he breathed out, forcing the words through his failing lungs. I frowned, completely confused. The old house on Maple Street was the original property our family had lived in decades ago, long before the logistics business became successful. It was a dilapidated, crumbling structure sitting on a massive plot of industrial dirt, right next to the current company headquarters. Nobody had lived in it for 20 years. It was essentially a rotting tear-down project. "Yes, Dad," I replied softly, smoothing the thin hair back from his forehead. "I remember the house. Just rest now." He shook his head slightly, refusing to let the subject go. His grip on my fingers grew desperate. "It looks broken, Sarah." He wheezed, his chest straining with the massive effort required to speak. He locked his fading eyes directly onto mine, ensuring I was hanging on to his every word. "But look inside the walls. Look inside the walls." The bizarre instruction hung in the quiet air of the hospital room. I stared at him, utterly bewildered, wondering if the morphine was finally causing terminal hallucinations. Why would he be talking about a rotting, abandoned structure in his final moments, Dad? I do not understand, I whispered, leaning even closer to catch his breath. What is inside the walls? He opened his mouth to explain. I saw his jaw work, saw the fierce determination in his eyes as he tried to pull one last sentence from his failing body. But the sentence never came. A deep hollow rattle sounded from the very bottom of his chest. His eyes suddenly lost their intense focus, drifting upward toward the ceiling. The tight, desperate grip he had on my hand completely relaxed, his fingers sliding loosely against my palm. The slow, irregular beeping of the heart monitor flattened out into one long, continuous tone. The sound pierced through the heavy silence of the room, sharp and unforgiving. A nurse rushed through the doorway a moment later, her rubber shoes squeaking against the linoleum, but I did not look up. I sat perfectly still in the amber light, holding the cold hand of the man who had just left me entirely alone in the world. He was gone. I was sitting in a room that had cost me my entire future, holding an $88,000 burden on my shoulders, utterly crushed by the weight of a grief that defied description. But as the nurses gently guided me out of the room to prepare his body, his final cryptic words echoed relentlessly in my mind. It looks broken, but look inside the walls. I walked out into the freezing December night, staring up at the starless sky. I had absolutely no money, no safety net, and a brother who was actively waiting to inherit a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. But as I pulled my worn coat tightly around my shivering shoulders, I realized my father had not just given me a goodbye. He had given me a map, and I was going to follow it. Funerals have a very specific, unforgettable atmosphere. It is a suffocating mixture of wet wool coats, overly sweet floral arrangements, and the bitter metallic scent of forced sympathy. We buried my father on a miserable sleet-filled Thursday morning. The sky over the cemetery was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a downpour that perfectly matched the hollow ache sitting in the center of my chest. I stood at the edge of the manicured grass, shivering in the same plain black dress I had worn to my grandfather's funeral 10 years prior. I was utterly exhausted. My bones felt like lead, and my bank account was completely empty, but I was there to honor the man who had given me everything. Bradley, on the other hand, treated our father's memorial service like a high-stakes corporate networking mixer. He arrived 20 minutes late in a procession of black luxury vehicles. He stepped out of his chauffeured car wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that easily cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. Chloe followed close behind him, draped in dark cashmere and wearing oversized designer sunglasses, complaining audibly to anyone who would listen about how the damp cemetery grass was completely ruining her suede stiletto heels. As the mourners gathered around the gravesite, I watched in absolute disgust as my brother worked the crowd. He was not accepting condolences so much as he was accepting congratulations. He shook hands with private equity investors, clapped regional supply chain managers on the shoulder, and even handed out his glossy new business cards near the casket. He was utilizing our father's death as a strategic opportunity to solidify his new position as the uncontested king of Jenkins Regional Logistics. I stood completely alone under a cheap black umbrella watching the spectacle. Several of my father's oldest employees, men who had driven trucks for him back when the company was just a single warehouse, came over to press my hand and share quiet, genuine tears. They knew the truth. They had seen me at the hospice center. They knew who had actually shown up during those final agonizing months. But the corporate suits the people Bradley was desperately trying to impress looked right past me as if I were a ghost. The absolute pinnacle of his delusion came during the church service. The wooden pews were packed with hundreds of attendees. When it was time for the eulogy, Bradley walked up to the pulpit with a slow, practiced stride. He adjusted the microphone, looked out over the crowd, and let out a deep theatrical sigh that was perfectly calculated to project maximum emotional burden. "My father was a titan of industry," Bradley began, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "He built an empire from the ground up. But in his final years as his health declined, that heavy mantle fell entirely on my shoulders. I had to step up. I had to be the rock this family needed. I sat in the third row, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my fingernails were cutting half-moons into my palms. It was not easy. Bradley continued, reaching up to wipe a completely non-existent tear from the corner of his eye. Watching the man you admire most fade away takes a terrible toll. Managing his complex medical care, ensuring he had the absolute best palliative treatment, carrying the immense financial and emotional weight of his final days, while simultaneously trying to keep his company afloat. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but I did it for him. I carried this family because that is what a devoted son does. A collective sympathetic murmur rippled through the congregation. I saw several women dabbing their eyes with tissues. Chloe, sitting in the front row, reached out and placed a supportive hand on Bradley's leg as he stepped down from the pulpit. My vision actually went white with rage. The sheer staggering audacity of his lies made my stomach physically churn. He was standing in a holy place in front of our father's casket, taking public credit for the $88,000 I had personally paid to keep our dad from dying in a crowded county ward. He was accepting the tearful admiration of hundreds of people for a financial and emotional sacrifice he absolutely refused to make. He had spent those months drinking vintage wine at the country club while I was sleeping in vinyl hospital chairs and liquidating my entire life savings. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up. I wanted to march up to that pulpit, grab the microphone, and scream the truth. I wanted to demand that he produce a single hospital receipt with his name on it. I wanted to tear down his perfectly curated facade and expose him as the greedy, entitled fraud he truly was. But I looked at the polished oak casket resting at the front of the altar, and I forced myself to swallow the bile rising in my throat. My father was a man of quiet dignity. He hated public spectacles. He despised unnecessary drama. If I caused a scene, if I turned his sacred memorial into a screaming match over money and lies, I would be disrespecting his memory. I would be stooping to Bradley's level, so I bit my tongue. I sat in absolute silence, tasting the metallic tang of blood where I had bitten the inside of my cheek. I allowed Bradley to play the weeping hero for his corporate audience. I chose dignity over drama, knowing deep in my heart that a public screaming match would not recover my lost retirement funds or change the past. The truth did not need an audience today. It just needed time. The service eventually ended. I slipped out a side door, avoiding the lavish catered reception Bradley was hosting at a nearby luxury hotel. I drove back to my freezing empty apartment, crawled into bed in my clothes, and slept for 14 straight hours. The morning after a funeral is always a bizarre, disorienting experience. The adrenaline that carries you through the logistics of death completely evaporates, leaving nothing behind but an echoing, hollow reality. The world expects you to simply wake up and resume your life, but your life has been fundamentally, permanently altered. I woke up on Friday morning feeling completely detached from my own body. I made a cup of cheap instant coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window at the gray suburban street. I needed an emotional anchor. I needed something tangible to remind me of the man I had just buried. My father had a beautiful, heavy brass compass that his own father had given him. He kept it on the corner of his massive mahogany desk at the logistics headquarters. He used to let me play with it when I was a little girl, sitting on his office floor, coloring on scrap paper while he reviewed shipping manifests. I wanted that compass. I did not want money. I did not want shares in the company. I just wanted that small physical piece of my childhood. I put on a clean sweater, grabbed my car keys, and drove across town to the Jenkins Regional Logistics headquarters. The building was a sprawling modern facility made of glass and steel, completely dominating the commercial block. I had practically grown up in these halls. I knew the receptionist. I knew the warehouse managers. I knew the exact layout of the executive suite. But when I walked through the sliding glass doors into the main lobby, everything felt intensely unfamiliar. The warm, welcoming atmosphere my father had cultivated for 3 decades was completely gone, replaced by a cold, sterile corporate rigidity. I walked straight toward the security turnstiles, offering a tired smile to the man standing behind the reception desk. I did not recognize him. He was a heavily built man in a sharp black uniform, and he stepped directly into my path before I could even reach the electronic gates. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, holding up a large hand. "Can I help you?" "Hi, I am Sarah Jenkins," I replied softly, assuming my last name would instantly clear up any confusion. Thomas Jenkins was my father. I'm just heading up to his old office to collect a few personal items from his desk. I will only be a moment. The security guard's expression remained completely blank. He looked down at a digital tablet resting on his podium. "I am sorry, Ms. Jenkins, but your name is not on the authorized access list." I blinked, thoroughly confused. Authorized access list. I do not need to be on a list. My father founded this company. My brother is the CEO. I just need to go upstairs for 5 minutes. "I cannot let you pass this point without explicit executive authorization," the guard stated firmly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Mr. Bradley Jenkins issued a new security protocol this morning. No unapproved visitors are allowed past the lobby, family included." A cold spike of dread shot through my stomach. A new security protocol. The morning after our father's funeral. Before I could argue further, the polished steel doors of the private executive elevator chimed open. Bradley stepped into the lobby. He was wearing another immaculate suit, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee and dictating rapid-fire instructions to a nervous-looking administrative assistant trailing behind him. He stopped when he saw me standing at the security desk. He did not look surprised. He looked profoundly annoyed. He waved the assistant away and walked slowly over to the turnstiles, safely positioning himself on the other side of the security barrier. "Sarah." He sighed, adopting that same patronizing tone he had used at the country club. "What are you doing here? We are incredibly busy today. The private equity transition team is arriving in an hour to begin assessing the corporate portfolio." "I am here to get Dad's brass compass," I said, keeping my voice absolutely steady, despite the furious pounding of my heart, "and maybe a few of the framed family photos from his credenza. That is all. It will take me exactly 2 minutes." Bradley took a slow sip of his coffee, looking at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into his pristine lobby. He shook his head slowly. "I am sorry, Sarah, but that is not going to be possible," he said smoothly. "I had the custodial team clear out that office last night. All non-essential items were boxed up and sent to a disposal facility. The new supply chain director is moving into that space on Monday, and I needed it completely modernized." My breath hitched. "You threw away his personal things," I demanded, my voice finally cracking. "You threw away his photos, his compass. It has barely been 24 hours since we put him in the ground." Bradley's eyes narrowed. The charming facade dropped completely, revealing the absolute cruelty underneath. "The business is mine now, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Dad wanted it this way. He knew I was the only one capable of taking this company to the next level. I am streamlining operations. I am cutting the dead weight. And I am preparing this company for a massive financial acquisition. I do not have time for your sentimental hoarding." He leaned closer to the security barrier, ensuring only I could hear his next words. "You need to leave. You have absolutely no legal standing here. You are not an employee. You are not a shareholder, and you are not welcome. We do not need you poking around and disrupting the workflow because you are feeling emotional. Go back to your little payroll job and leave the real business to the adults." He gave a curt nod to the security guard. "Escort her out. If she refuses to leave, call the police and have her trespassed from the property." I stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. He was not just protecting his territory. He was actively punishing me. He was erasing our father's legacy overnight and aggressively barring me from the only physical connection I had left to the man who raised us. The security guard placed a heavy, firm hand on my shoulder, turning me toward the sliding glass doors. "Ma'am, it is time to go." I did not fight him. I let the guard walk me out into the freezing parking lot. I stood by my ancient car, watching Bradley turn around and walk back into his private elevator, ascending to his ivory tower, while I was literally thrown out into the cold. As I unlocked my car door, The crushing weight of grief I had been carrying suddenly evaporated. The sadness was completely burned away by a cold, calculating fury. Bradley had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with an emotional, grieving sister who could be easily bullied into submission. He thought his position as the self-proclaimed king made him untouchable. He had just turned an emotional family dispute into a direct territorial war. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. I remembered my father's dying words. The old house on Maple Street. It looks broken, Sarah. But look inside the walls. I put the car in gear and drove away from the gleaming corporate headquarters. I was done crying. I was done playing the passive victim. Bradley wanted a war over assets and territory. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him inside those walls. The waiting room of the law office smelled faintly of lemon polish, stale coffee, and old paper. It was a suffocating combination that only added to the heavy anxiety sitting squarely in my chest. 3 weeks had passed since we buried my father. 3 weeks of absolute silence from my brother, 3 weeks of dodging phone calls from collection agencies, and 3 weeks of wondering if the $88,000 sacrifice I made would end up being the anchor that finally pulled me under. I sat on a rigid leather sofa, staring blindly at a framed painting of a sailboat on the opposite wall. The steady, relentless ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound in the room. My father had retained Mr. Abernathy to handle his legal affairs nearly 3 decades ago. Abernathy was a relic of a bygone era, an incredibly traditional estate attorney who operated out of a modest brick building near the historic district. He was not the type of high-powered corporate lawyer Bradley usually associated with, which explained why my brother was currently pacing the length of the waiting room like a caged animal. Bradley checked his luxury watch for what felt like the 5th time in 10 minutes. He was dressed in a sharp slate gray suit that probably cost more than my car. Chloe sat nearby, perfectly poised, tapping her manicured fingernails against the screen of her newest smartphone. Neither of them had offered a single word of greeting when I walked through the door. They looked at me as though I were an administrative error they were forced to endure before collecting their prize. The heavy oak door to the inner office finally creaked open. Mr. Abernathy stood in the doorway, looking remarkably older than the last time I had seen him. His shoulders stooped slightly under his tweed jacket, and he held a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. "Come in, please," he said, his voice carrying a soft, gravelly tone. "We have a lot of ground to cover today." Bradley immediately stopped pacing and ushered Chloe through the door, aggressively taking the lead. I followed quietly behind them, taking a seat at the far end of a long mahogany conference table. The room was lined with towering bookshelves filled with thick, leather-bound legal volumes. It felt heavy and incredibly formal, a room designed for finality. Mr. Abernathy took his place at the head of the table. He spent a few agonizing minutes organizing his reading glasses, shuffling the pristine white pages of the last will and testament, and clearing his throat. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost physical. Bradley sat leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes practically burning a hole through the documents on the table. "This is the last will and testament of Thomas Edward Jenkins." Mr. Abernathy began his words slow and measured. It was executed several years ago before his health significantly declined, and remains the only legally binding directive regarding his assets. I kept my eyes fixed on the grain of the mahogany wood. I expected nothing. I had long ago made peace with the fact that Bradley was the chosen heir to the logistics empire. I was only there out of a profound sense of duty to my father's memory. Mr. Abernathy read through the standard legal boilerplate establishing his role as the executor of the estate and confirming the payment of outstanding funeral expenses. Then he turned the page and shifted his posture, adjusting his glasses to focus on the primary asset division. "To my son, Bradley. Thomas Jenkins." Mr. Abernathy read aloud, his voice steady in the quiet room. "I hereby bequeath the entirety of my business assets, including 100% of the controlling shares in Jenkins Regional Logistics. This transfer includes all corporate bank accounts, the entire commercial transportation fleet, all active regional distribution contracts, and the exclusive rights to the company branding and intellectual property. Bradley let out a long, audible exhale. He physically slumped back into his leather chair, a massive smile spreading across his face. Chloe immediately reached over and squeezed his arm, her eyes wide with unmasked greed. It was the absolute validation of his golden boy status. He had just been officially crowned a multi-million-dollar chief executive officer by legal decree. Mr. Abernathy paused, looking up from the document to offer Bradley a polite professional nod. "It is a substantial operation, Bradley. Your father was incredibly proud of what he built. He trusted you to keep the wheels turning." "I will take it to heights he never even imagined," Bradley replied smoothly, already adopting the arrogant posture of a corporate conqueror. "The private equity guys are going to love this clean transfer." Mr. Abernathy frowned slightly at the mention of private equity, but he quickly returned his attention to the paperwork. He turned another page and the room grew quiet once more. "And now for the remainder of the physical estate," Mr. Abernathy said. He looked directly at me, his expression softening with a strange mixture of sympathy and hesitation. "To my daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Jenkins, I hereby bequeath the original family property located on Maple Street, including the residential structure and the immediate plot of land upon which it sits to be owned outright and free of any mortgage encumbrances." The silence that followed was absolute. I sat completely frozen, my mind struggling to process the words. The old house on Maple Street. It was the very first property my parents had ever purchased long before the logistics company existed. We had moved out of it when I was just a toddler, relocating to a nicer neighborhood, once the trucking contract started bringing in real money. My father had kept the deed for sentimental reasons, utilizing the massive empty dirt lot behind the house to park his very first commercial delivery trucks. But the house itself had been entirely abandoned for over 2 decades. It was a complete disaster. The roof had partially caved in after a severe winter storm 5 years ago. The foundation was cracked. The front porch was sagging and dangerous. The entire property was completely swallowed by overgrown blackberry brambles and suffocating weeds. The city had sent multiple warning citations about the state of the property, threatening to condemn the structure entirely. It was not a home. It was a massive financial liability. It was a rotting pile of wood that required thousands of dollars in property taxes every single year just to keep the city inspectors at bay. I stared at Mr. Abernathy, desperately trying to keep my face neutral. I had sacrificed my retirement. I had given up $88,000 to keep our father breathing. Bradley was walking away with a thriving, highly profitable commercial empire, and I was being handed the keys to a condemned, mold-infested, tear-down project. The sound of a sharp, cruel laugh shattered the silence in the office. I turned my head. Bradley was leaning back in his chair, openly chuckling. He brought a hand up to cover his mouth, but the amusement dancing in his eyes was entirely unchecked. Chloe was sitting beside him, a vicious smirk playing on her lips, looking at me as if I were the punchline to a terrible joke. "I am sorry," Bradley said, waving his hand dismissively toward Mr. Abernathy. "I do not mean to be disrespectful, but you have to admit the irony here is absolutely incredible." Mr. Abernathy stiffened, clearly offended by the breach of decorum. "This is a formal legal proceeding, Bradley. I would ask that you maintain a level of professional respect." Bradley waved him off, turning his arrogant gaze directly onto me. "Oh, come on. Sarah is sitting there acting like a martyr, and Dad leaves her the neighborhood-haunted house. That place is a complete biohazard. The city is probably going to fine you just for putting your name on the deed." A hot flush of intense humiliation crept up the back of my neck. I felt the heat rushing into my cheeks. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to flip the heavy mahogany table right onto his lap. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs about the grueling, agonizing nights I had spent in the palliative care unit while he was out buying $90,000 luxury cars. I wanted to drag him by his expensive lapels and force him to look at the massive red numbers on my bank statements. "Have fun with the mold," Sarah Bradley continued, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "Honestly, you should just hire a bulldozer to level the place. Or better yet, maybe you can slap some cheap paint on the rotting walls and flip it for grocery money. I know things are probably a little tight for you right now, considering your amazing budget management skills." He was twisting the knife. He knew exactly how desperate my financial situation was, and he was taking active pleasure in watching me receive an inheritance that would only drive me further into debt. Chloe let out a soft, mocking giggle, adjusting her designer handbag on her lap. I gripped the arms of my leather chair so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. My heart was hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. Every instinct screaming inside my body demanded that I fight back, that I demand fairness, that I challenge the will right then and there. But then the polished wood of the conference room seemed to fade away. The arrogant laughter of my brother receded into a dull hum. Instead, I saw the dim amber lighting of the hospice room. I felt the icy cold grip of my father's fragile fingers wrapping around my hand. I heard the desperate rattling wheeze in his chest as he utilized the very last ounce of his strength to deliver a message only to me. "It looks broken, Sarah. But look inside the walls." My father was not a cruel man. He was not a man who played sick jokes on his children. He was meticulous, highly observant, and deeply strategic. He had built a logistics empire from a single truck by paying absolute attention to the smallest details. If he deliberately chose to leave me a rotting, abandoned structure while handing Bradley a multi-million-dollar business, there was a profoundly specific reason. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I commanded the racing of my heart to slow down. I released my death grip on the arms of the chair and calmly placed my hands flat on the table in front of me. I looked directly at Bradley. His smile was wide, full of teeth, utterly convinced of his absolute superiority. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to cry, to beg, to throw a tantrum, so he could justify his narrative that I was just an unstable, bitter woman. I refused to give him the satisfaction. "The house is fine, Bradley," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, completely devoid of the anger currently boiling in my stomach. "It is a piece of family history. I am perfectly happy to accept it." Bradley's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had clearly expected a fight. He wanted a dramatic confrontation to validate his victory. My total lack of resistance clearly unsettled him, but his massive ego quickly smoothed over his momentary confusion. "Suit yourself," he sneered, straightening his tie. "Do not come crying to my corporate office when the property taxes bankrupt you. The business is not bailing you out of a bad real estate investment." "I will keep that in mind," I replied softly. Mr. Abernathy looked between us, a heavy sadness visible in his tired eyes. He reached into his thick manila folder and pulled out a heavy rusted brass key attached to a faded leather tag. He slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table toward me. "This belongs to you now, Sarah," Mr. Abernathy said gently. "The necessary transfer documents have already been drafted. I simply need your signature to officially process the deed into your name." I picked up the key. The metal was cold and heavy in my palm. It felt like holding a solid piece of my father's history. I took the black pen Mr. Abernathy offered and signed my name on the dotted line with a perfectly steady hand. I did not hesitate. I did not complain. Bradley signed his own stack of corporate transfer documents with aggressive, sweeping strokes, looking like a man signing a peace treaty after winning a glorious war. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and shook Mr. Abernathy's hand with excessive enthusiasm. "Thank you for your time," Abernathy Bradley declared loudly. "I am sure you will see my name in the business journals very soon. We are taking Jenkins Regional Logistics Global." He turned and walked toward the heavy oak door, Chloe trailing closely behind him. They did not say goodbye to me. They walked out of the office entirely consumed by their own delusion of absolute success, leaving me sitting quietly at the table with nothing but a rusted key and a massive pile of debt. I waited until the sound of their footsteps completely faded down the hallway. Mr. Abernathy began packing his documents back into the folder, letting out a weary sigh. "I am truly sorry, Sarah," the old lawyer murmured, not meeting my eyes. "Your father made these arrangements a long time ago." I tried to counsel him on a more equitable division of assets when his health began to decline, but he was incredibly stubborn about this specific distribution. I looked down at the brass key resting in the center of my palm. "Do not apologize, Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice carrying a sudden crystal-clear resolve. My father knew exactly what he was doing. I stood up, slipped the key deep into my coat pocket, and walked out of the law office into the freezing winter afternoon. Bradley had just claimed his victory. He thought he had completely crushed me. He thought the dilapidated house was the ultimate insult, a final confirmation of my utter insignificance in the family hierarchy. But he was blinded by his own staggering arrogance. I got into my freezing car and turned the key in the ignition. I was not going home. I was going to Maple Street. It was time to find out exactly what was hidden inside those walls. The drive to Maple Street took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into an entirely different universe. Away from the manicured lawns and towering glass high-rises of the commercial district, this older industrial zoning border was a graveyard of forgotten infrastructure. I pulled my 12-year-old sedan up to the curb and simply stared through the windshield. My father had not exaggerated. The house looked completely, utterly broken. It sat on a massive, weed-choked plot of land that backed directly up to the towering chain-link fence of the Jenkins Regional Logistics main dispatch yard. The visual contrast was almost comedic. On one side of the fence, millions of dollars worth of sleek modern delivery trucks idled on freshly paved asphalt. On my side, a sagging two-story, Victorian structure groaned under the weight of decades of absolute neglect. The roof shingles were curling and black with decay. The front porch dipped at a dangerous angle, choked by thick, thorny blackberry brambles that seemed to be actively swallowing the wood. There were deep cracks spiderwebbing up the concrete foundation. It was exactly the kind of pathetic, worthless eyesore that would make my brother laugh. I zipped my coat up to my chin against the biting December wind and stepped out of the car. The freezing air stung my cheeks as I navigated the broken concrete path. I pulled the heavy, rusted brass key Mr. Abernathy had given me from my pocket. It slid into the deadbolt with a harsh metallic grind. It took 3 hard shoves with my shoulder to force the swollen wood of the front door open. The moment I stepped across the threshold, a wave of stagnant, freezing air washed over me. The smell was overpowering, a thick, suffocating mixture of wet rot, ancient dust, and decaying timber. The interior was stripped bare, entirely emptied of all furniture and completely devoid of warmth. Peeling strips of faded yellow wallpaper hung from the plaster like dead skin. The original hardwood floors were warped and buckled, covered in a thick layer of grime that completely muffled my footsteps. I stood in the center of the ruined living room, my breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. The silence was heavy and oppressive. Why would my father leave me this? I asked the empty room aloud. Why would he let Bradley humiliate me like this? Then his final rattling breath echoed clearly in my memory. "Look inside the walls." I took a deep breath, fighting down a wave of pure exhaustion, and began the search. I started in the living room, running my bare, freezing hands along the decaying baseboards, tapping on the cracked plaster to listen for hollow sounds. I moved into the kitchen, pulling open rotting cabinet doors, checking behind the rusted-out shell of an ancient oven. Nothing. I spent a full hour methodically sweeping the entire ground floor. Every corner, every closet, every loose piece of trim. My hands were completely covered in dirt and spiderwebs, my knees aching from crawling across the freezing floorboards. I found absolutely nothing but dead insects and loose nails. Doubt began to creep into the back of my mind. What if I had misunderstood him? What if the intense morphine dosage had simply caused a nonsensical hallucination in his final moments? What if Bradley was right, and I was just an unhinged, bitter woman, desperately searching for meaning in a pile of garbage? No, I refused to believe that. My father was a master strategist. He built an empire from the ground up. He did not waste words. I walked to the bottom of the main staircase. The wooden steps groaned ominously in protest as I climbed to the second floor. The air up here was even colder, seeping through cracks in the roof where the winter sky was visible. There were 3 bedrooms. I bypassed the smaller ones and walked directly into the master suite. This was the room where my parents had slept when I was an infant. Now it was just a barren square box of peeling paint and severe water damage. I walked straight to the walk-in closet at the back of the room. The door was completely missing from its hinges. Inside the space was cloaked in heavy shadows. I pulled out my cell phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp sting of the cold wood against my skin. I began pressing my palms against every single plank, applying my full body weight. One board near the far left corner felt slightly different. It did not just creak, it yielded. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dug my fingernails into the narrow gap between the planks, desperately prying at the wood. It was incredibly stubborn, sealed tight by years of accumulated grime. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the sharp pain as a splinter drove deep into my thumb and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left. With a loud, sharp crack, the 2-foot section of the floorboard popped completely free. I aimed my phone flashlight down into the dark, dusty cavity between the joists. Resting at the very bottom, completely untouched by the mold and decay of the surrounding house, was a heavy industrial-grade steel lockbox. I reached down into the dark cavity and grabbed the thick steel handle of the box. It was incredibly heavy, practically fighting me as I hauled it up out of the floorboards and dragged it into the center of the master bedroom, where the gray afternoon light filtered through a cracked window pane. The box was secured with a heavy-duty combination padlock. I stared at the numerical dials, my mind racing. A combination. I needed a combination. I tried my father's birthday. The lock did not budge. I tried the year he founded the logistics company. Nothing. I sat back on my heels, taking a deep, shuddering breath, trying to channel his intensely analytical mind. What number would he use for a secret he was hiding specifically for me? My birthday. I quickly spun the cold metal dials to match the exact month, day, and year I was born. I grabbed the heavy clasp and pulled. With a satisfying heavy mechanical click, the padlock sprang open. I threw the latch back and lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside, resting on top of a thick stack of legal documents, was a crisp white envelope with my name written in my father's familiar sharp handwriting. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely tear the paper open. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock stationery. The ink was dark and deliberate. I took a deep breath of the freezing air and began to read. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means Bradley has shown you exactly who he really is. I am so profoundly sorry that I left you to bear the heavy burden of my final days alone. I knew you would be the one to show up. You have always been the foundation of this family, the quiet strength working in the background. Bradley only cares about money, status, and the illusion of power. He views kindness as a weakness to be exploited. I could not leave my legacy in the hands of a man who would abandon his own blood. I read the words again, my vision blurring with sudden hot tears. He knew. He had seen the entire dynamic, even when I thought I was suffering completely in the shadows. The letter continued. I built a trap, Sarah. A perfectly legal, inescapable trap designed specifically for your brother's massive ego. Bradley thinks he inherited an empire today. He thinks he owns Jenkins Regional Logistics. But a logistics business is absolutely nothing without a place to park its trucks. What Bradley does not know, and what my old attorney Mr. Abernathy does not know, is that I never legally transferred the land under the company headquarters to the corporate entity. 30 years ago, I legally tied the entire commercial staging yard, the parking lots, and the warehouse footprints directly to the residential deed of this old house on Maple Street. My jaw literally dropped open. I scrambled to read the next paragraph, my eyes darting frantically across the ink. Whoever owns the deed to the old house owns the ground the company stands on. But I went one step further. Beneath this letter, you will find a secondary overriding trust document. It was drafted by a highly specialized forensic corporate attorney named Mr. Sterling. This document supersedes Abernathy's outdated paperwork. It contains a contingency of character clause. Bradley's inheritance of the operating company is entirely conditional. He has exactly 30 days from the time of my death to fully reimburse my primary medical caretaker for every single cent spent on my end of life care. If he fails to pay that debt, his shares in the company are completely voided and revert immediately back to the owner of the land. The breath completely left my lungs. I sat on the rotting floorboards of an abandoned house holding a piece of paper that held the power to detonate a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. The final lines of the letter were written with heavy, absolute finality. Do not warn him, Sarah. Do not beg him for help. Let his greed blind him. Gather your receipts, wait for the 30-day window to expire, and then go see Attorney Sterling. The business card is in the box. Take back what you are owed. You are the rightful heir to my legacy. I love you, Dad. I carefully set the letter down on the dusty floor. Beneath it, inside the lockbox, was a thick, professionally bound legal folio bearing the embossed seal of Sterling Corporate Law. I opened the cover. Right there, explicitly detailed in impenetrable corporate legal jargon, was the exact contingency clause my father had described. It was an ironclad, indisputable legal trap. Bradley thought I was a spineless, irrelevant payroll clerk. He thought he had outsmarted me, leaving me bankrupt and holding the keys to a condemned neighborhood eyesore while he waltzed away with $12 million worth of commercial equity. He was completely convinced that his aggressive corporate routine made him legally untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his perfectly tailored Italian leather shoes literally belonged to me. I looked at the heavy brass key resting in my palm. An hour ago, it was a symbol of my ultimate humiliation. Now it was the key to his absolute destruction. I packed the document safely back into the steel lockbox, closed the lid, and locked the padlock. I stood up in the freezing, ruined bedroom, brushing the ancient dust from the knees of my slacks. The cold no longer bothered me. The crushing exhaustion that had weighed me down for 2 agonizing years had completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, focused adrenaline. I was an accountant. I knew exactly how to track every single penny of the $88,000 I had spent. I had the invoices, the bank transfer confirmations, the credit card statements, and the cleared checks. Bradley was currently out celebrating his massive inheritance, actively trying to sell a logistics company that was sitting on my private property. I picked up the lockbox, carrying it against my chest like a shield. I walked down the groaning staircase, stepped out into the biting winter wind, and firmly locked the front door of my house. The 30-day countdown had officially begun. I was not going to shed another tear. I was going to let my brother dig his own grave dollar by dollar, day by day, and when the timer hit 0, I was going to bury him in it. The drive from the decaying property on Maple Street into the heart of the downtown financial district felt like crossing a bridge between 2 completely different eras of my life. The rusted lockbox sat safely in the passenger seat of my car, its heavy steel frame resting against the worn upholstery. Inside that box was my father's final act of protection. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with a singular, unbreakable focus. My hands were no longer numb from the freezing drafts of the abandoned house. They were completely steady, gripping the steering wheel with the quiet intensity of a woman who had just realized she held the winning hand in a high-stakes game. Sterling Corporate Law was located on the 32nd floor of a pristine glass skyscraper that overlooked the bustling riverfront. It was a massive departure from the cramped, dusty brick building where Mr. Abernathy peddled his outdated estate services. When I stepped off the elevator, my boots sank into thick charcoal gray carpet. The reception area was an absolute vision of modern corporate power, all brushed steel, sharp geometric lines, and soundproof glass panels. I approached the sleek marble desk and gave the receptionist my name. I did not have an appointment, but I told her I possessed highly sensitive estate documents directly from the late Thomas Jenkins. I barely had time to sit down in the plush waiting area before a tall man in a sharply tailored navy suit pushed through the glass doors. He had striking silver hair, keen gray eyes, and the commanding presence of a man who routinely dismantled hostile corporate takeovers before his morning coffee. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, extending a firm hand, "I am Jonathan Sterling. I have been expecting your arrival." He guided me into a massive corner office bathed in cool winter sunlight. There were no paintings of sailboats or ticking grandfather clocks here, just a massive glass desk, multiple digital displays, and an atmosphere of pure, unfiltered competence. I sat down and placed the heavy legal folio and my father's handwritten letter directly on the glass surface between us. Mr. Sterling picked up the letter first. He read it in absolute silence. I watched his face, carefully searching for a reaction. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his sharp features. He set the letter down and reached for the thick legal folio, running his fingertips over the embossed seal of his own firm on the cover. "Your father was a truly brilliant man," Mr. Sterling murmured, his voice laced with profound respect. "He came to me 18 months ago, shortly after his initial diagnosis. He knew his health was failing, and he explicitly told me that he did not trust his standard estate attorney to handle a matter of this magnitude. He said Abernathy was too traditional, too easily bullied by your brother, and utterly incapable of executing a hostile corporate maneuver." A hostile maneuver? I repeated the reality of my father's strategy slowly settling into my bones. "Precisely," Mr. Sterling nodded, opening the thick folio and smoothing the crisp white pages flat against his desk. "Thomas knew exactly who Bradley was. He knew your brother was completely driven by ego and unchecked greed. He also knew that you were the quiet anchor of the family. He predicted with terrifying accuracy that Bradley would abandon his care, hoard the company resources, and leave you to shoulder the catastrophic financial burden of his medical decline." My chest tightened as the lawyer spoke. It was incredibly validating to hear someone else acknowledge the brutal reality I had lived through. I had spent 2 years feeling like I was losing my mind, constantly gaslighted into believing my sacrifices were just basic expectations, while my brother paraded around as a wealthy chief executive officer. "So your father asked me to draft a completely impenetrable secondary trust," Mr. Sterling explained, turning the documents toward me so I could see the dense paragraphs of legal text. "This document was designed to completely bypass Abernathy's standard will. It is a fail-safe mechanism entirely built around a highly specialized legal concept known as a contingency of character clause." I leaned forward, my analytical mind immediately engaging. A contingency of character. It sounded like something out of a medieval fairy tale, a test designed to measure the true worth of an heir before granting them the kingdom. But this was not a fairy tale. This was modern corporate law, and the kingdom in question was a logistics empire generating millions of dollars in annual revenue. "What exactly does the clause require?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet, sunlit office. Mr. Sterling folded his hands together, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intense, predatory gleam. "It requires your brother to prove he possesses the bare minimum of human decency before he is allowed to claim his throne. And based on what you have told me about his behavior at the funeral and his recent attempt to lock you out of the corporate headquarters, I am willing to bet my legal license that he is about to fail this test spectacularly." Mr. Sterling reached for a sleek silver pen and began pointing to specific highlighted sections of the dense legal text. He broke down the intricate mechanisms of the trust with the surgical precision of a master tactician, explaining a flawless battle plan. "The first requirement of the contingency clause is strictly financial," Mr. Sterling stated, tapping the heavy paper. "The document explicitly dictates that Bradley's inheritance of the Jenkins Regional Logistics corporate entity is entirely conditional upon the full reimbursement of any and all medical expenses incurred by the primary caretaker during your father's final years." I stared at the words printed on the page, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. Full reimbursement. "The clause leaves absolutely no room for interpretation," the lawyer continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Bradley is legally required to identify the individual who paid for Thomas's palliative care, verify the total expenditure, and issue a full repayment from his personal or corporate accounts. Furthermore, he must execute this reimbursement within exactly 30 days of your father's passing." 30 days. My mind immediately raced back to the sickening conversation I had endured with Bradley at the diner and the brutal phone call where he told me to simply budget better while he leased a $90,000 luxury car for his arrogant wife. I had the complete ledger. Every single hospital invoice, every oxygen tank rental, every horrific penalty fee from my liquidated retirement account. The total was exactly $88,000. If he does not pay it within the 30-day window, I asked, tracing the edge of the legal folio with my fingertip, what happens to his ownership of the company? Mr. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a deeply satisfied expression crossing his face. That is where your father's true genius comes into play. If Bradley fails to satisfy the medical debt within the designated time frame, the transfer of the corporate shares becomes instantly null and void. But simply voiding the shares was not enough for your father. He wanted to ensure Bradley could not tie the business up in endless expensive probate litigation. So he instituted a brilliant real estate anchor. The lawyer flipped to the very last page of the folio, revealing a complex property survey map. When your father founded the logistics company 30 years ago, he purchased a massive industrial lot adjacent to the old family home on Maple Street, Mr. Sterling explained, tracing the property lines on the map. Over the decades, as the business expanded, he paved the lot, built the dispatch warehouses, and erected the modern glass headquarters. Everyone, including Bradley and the incredibly outdated Mr. Abernathy, assumed the land was owned by the corporate entity. But it is not, I realized, the sheer magnitude of the trap finally dawning on me. My father never transferred the industrial lot to the business. Exactly. Mr. Sterling smiled, a sharp, brilliant flash of teeth. He tethered the commercial land directly to the residential deed of the old Maple Street house. They are legally considered a single indivisible parcel of real estate. When Abernathy handed you the key to that dilapidated, rotting structure today, he unknowingly handed you the sole ownership of the entire commercial staging yard, the parking lots, and the physical ground beneath the logistics headquarters. Bradley owns the corporate name and the trucks, but he does not own the land they operate on. You are his landlord. I sat perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the staggering brilliance of my father's strategy. Bradley had openly laughed at me in the lawyer's office. He had told me to have fun with the mold and suggested I flip the ruined house for grocery money. He was absolutely convinced he had won the war. He was completely unaware that he was parking millions of dollars worth of commercial shipping equipment on private property that belonged exclusively to the sister he had abandoned to bankruptcy. And the reversion mechanism is the final nail in the coffin, Mr. Sterling said softly, his voice pulling me back from my thoughts. If Bradley fails the contingency of character test, if he lets the 30-day window expire without reimbursing your $88,000, his corporate shares dissolve. Per the terms of this trust, 100% of the controlling interest in Jenkins Regional Logistics automatically reverts to the legal owner of the physical land. It reverts to me. I whispered the words, feeling incredibly heavy and powerful in the quiet room. It reverts to you. Mr. Sterling confirmed, closing the thick legal folio with a resounding thud. You become the sole proprietor of the real estate and the sole owner of the multi-million-dollar corporation. Bradley will be left with absolutely nothing. No company, no headquarters, and no executive salary to fund his luxury lifestyle. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office, watching the gray winter clouds rolling over the city skyline. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, the crushing, suffocating weight of my financial terror completely vanished. I had spent countless nights crying at my kitchen table, terrified of bill collectors, terrified of losing my father, terrified of the bleak, empty future stretching out before me. I had endured my brother's cruel taunts, Chloe's nasty remarks, and the absolute humiliation of being barred from my own father's corporate office by a hired security guard. Bradley thought he was a brilliant chief executive officer orchestrating a $12 million acquisition with a massive private equity firm. He thought my silence at the funeral and my quiet acceptance of the old house meant I was a weak, defeated victim. He did not realize that a corporate payroll specialist knows how to keep records. I had an ironclad digital paper trail proving every single cent I had spent keeping our father comfortable. I had the bank transfer logs from my ruined retirement account. "We do not say a word," I told Mr. Sterling, turning my attention back to the massive glass desk. "I want this kept completely confidential. We do not contact him. We do not request the money. We let the 30-day window run its course." Mr. Sterling nodded deeply clearly, impressed by my absolute resolve. "We let his greed run the clock down," he agreed. "When the 30 days expire, the trap snaps shut automatically." I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, feeling a profound, electrifying sense of power coursing through my veins. The emotional, grieving daughter was gone. I was stepping into my role as the rightful heir to Thomas Jenkins. I shook the attorney's hand, walked out of the towering glass skyscraper, and stepped into the freezing city streets. The 30-day countdown had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the silence. The greatest weapon a person can possess during a psychological war is the ability to remain absolutely silent. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to speak up only to apologize, to smooth over conflicts, or to beg for a fraction of the respect my brother was freely given. But as I walked out of Attorney Sterling's office and stepped into the bitter December wind, I realized that true power does not roar. True power sits quietly in the background, watches the enemy make their absolute final miscalculation, and simply waits for the clock to run out. The terms of my father's secondary trust were brilliantly unforgiving. Bradley had exactly 30 days from the date of our father's passing to completely reimburse me for the medical expenses I had shouldered alone. If the stroke of midnight on the 30th day passed without full payment, his shares in Jenkins Regional Logistics would instantly dissolve and revert to the owner of the land. That meant I had a very specific, agonizingly slow countdown to endure. I returned to my corporate payroll job the following Monday. I sat in my small cubicle staring at the dual monitors processing end-of-year tax documents for executives, while carrying a secret that was going to detonate my family's entire existence. I did not tell my coworkers. I did not confide in my few close friends. I honored my father's final instruction to the letter. I let my brother's greed blind him completely. Bradley wasted absolutely no time. While the dirt on our father's grave was barely settled, my brother threw himself into the corporate acquisition process with a sickening level of enthusiasm. Through the network of older employees who had remained fiercely loyal to my father, I received quiet, steady updates about the chaos unfolding at the logistics headquarters. Bradley was not interested in running the company. He had no desire to manage supply chains, negotiate with truck drivers, or navigate the complex logistics industry. He simply wanted to cash out and walk away with a massive pile of unearned wealth. He had engaged a massive private equity firm based out of Chicago called Apex Capital Partners. They were notorious in the business world for acquiring regional family-owned supply chain companies, stripping them of their valuable assets, and absorbing their delivery routes into a national conglomerate. Bradley saw them as his golden ticket. He wanted $12 million, a clean exit, and the freedom to spend the rest of his life playing golf and funding Chloe's extravagant designer shopping habits. During the second week of the countdown, I took my lunch break and drove my beaten-up sedan to a small coffee shop situated across the street from the Jenkins Regional Logistics main dispatch yard. I sat at a corner table with a lukewarm cup of black coffee watching through the rain-streaked window. Precisely at noon, a fleet of 3 sleek black town cars pulled through the main gates. Bradley was waiting for them in the courtyard, dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, rubbing his hands together in the freezing air. Several high-powered executives stepped out of the vehicles wearing expensive trench coats and carrying leather portfolios. I watched as my brother shook their hands, pointing proudly toward the massive modern warehouse, sweeping his arm across the paved lot, filled with commercial delivery trucks. He was giving them a grand tour of his supposed empire. He strutted across the asphalt with the unchecked arrogance of a self-made titan, pointing to the loading docks and the modern glass headquarters. But what fascinated me the most was what he completely ignored. Sitting just a few hundred yards away, physically attached to the exact same continuous plot of industrial dirt, was the dilapidated, rotting Victorian house my father had left me. The roof was caving in. The blackberry brambles were climbing the rotting wooden porch. Bradley did not even glance in its direction. He was so consumed by the illusion of his $12 million payout that he never stopped to question the property lines. He never wondered why our father, a man who built a business through meticulous planning, would leave such an enormous piece of adjoining land tied to a useless residential structure. He simply assumed the corporate entity owned the ground it stood on. He assumed my inheritance was nothing but an insulting joke. I watched him shake hands with the lead investor, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively trying to sell a multi-million-dollar operation that was sitting entirely on my private property. I finished my coffee, stood up, and drove back to my office. The restraint it took to keep from walking across the street and handing him an eviction notice was monumental, but I knew I had to play the long game. When the third week of the 30-day window arrived, I shifted my focus to the most crucial element of my father's legal trap. The contingency of character clause required me to produce documented, indisputable proof of the exact amount I had spent on end-of-life palliative care. I was a senior corporate payroll specialist. I investigated financial discrepancies, tracked missing assets, and balanced ledgers down to the final fraction of a cent. I knew exactly how to build a paper trail that no corporate lawyer or private equity firm could ever dismantle. I spent my evenings transforming my tiny dining table into a forensic accounting laboratory. I drove to my local bank branch and sat with the branch manager requesting certified stamped copies of my retirement account liquidation. I needed the official documents showing the precise date I withdrew the funds, the staggering early withdrawal tax penalties I had absorbed, and the exact routing numbers proving the money went directly to the hospice care facility. Next, I contacted the medical billing department at the palliative care center. I did not just ask for digital receipts. I requested that the head financial administrator physically print, sign, and notarize a comprehensive ledger of every single payment they had received from my personal accounts over the past 2 years. I collected the invoices for the specialized respiratory medications. I gathered the rental agreements for the industrial oxygen concentrators. I compiled the hourly billing statements for the round-the-clock nursing assistance my father had required in his final weeks. I purchased a heavy black leather binder and a set of clear protective sleeves. I organized the documents chronologically, building a devastating narrative of sacrifice and abandonment. Every single page represented a night I did not sleep, a meal I skipped, or a piece of my own future I had burned to keep our father safe. I cross-referenced every invoice with a corresponding bank statement highlighting the transfer dates in bright yellow ink. When I finally reached the last page and tallied the grand total on my adding machine, the number printed on the receipt tape was absolute and undeniable. Exactly $88,000.00. This binder was not just a collection of medical bills. It was a tangible, undeniable record of my brother's profound moral failure. It proved that while he was acting as the chief executive officer of a highly profitable company utilizing corporate funds to lease luxury vehicles and host extravagant networking dinners, he had forced his younger sister to completely bankrupt herself to keep their founder alive. As the final week of the 30-day countdown began, a strange, suffocating tension settled over my apartment. The reality of the situation was terrifying. If Bradley suddenly experienced a miracle crisis of conscience, if someone in his legal department stumbled upon the secondary trust and warned him, or if he simply decided to throw me a tiny fraction of the inheritance out of pity, the entire trap would fall apart. If he handed me a check for $88,000 before the clock struck midnight on the 30th day, he would pass the contingency test. He would secure his $12 million sale, and I would be left with a restored bank account, but a permanently broken heart, knowing he had won. Day 25 passed in absolute silence. Day 27 brought a heavy, relentless winter storm, but no communication from my brother. On the afternoon of day 29, just 36 hours before the legal window permanently closed, my cell phone vibrated on my desk. The screen illuminated, flashing a photograph of Bradley that I had assigned to his contact profile years ago. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribcage like a trapped bird. This was it. He had figured it out. He was calling to offer me the money. He was going to save his empire at the absolute last possible second. I stared at the vibrating phone for 5 long rings, forcing my hands to stop shaking before I finally picked it up and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice tight and guarded. Sarah Bradley barked, completely bypassing any standard greeting. His voice was rushed, vibrating with the manic energy of a man closing the biggest deal of his life. "Listen, I am in a meeting with the acquisition team from Apex Capital. We are finalizing the transition documents for the sale. The closing signature gala is scheduled for tomorrow night at the Grand Plaza Hotel." My stomach plummeted. He was selling it. He was actually finalizing the sale. "Okay," I replied slowly, gripping the edge of my desk. "Why are you calling me?" "The private equity guys are being ridiculous about historical documentation," Bradley sighed, sounding incredibly inconvenienced. "They are demanding to see the original architectural blueprints for the main dispatch warehouse. They want to verify the foundation's structural integrity before they wire the $12 million. Dad used to keep all that ancient paperwork boxed up at the house. Did you happen to find any blueprints when you were poking around that rotting pile of garbage on Maple Street?" I closed my eyes. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief and sorrow washed over me simultaneously. He had not figured it out. He had not experienced a sudden revelation of guilt. He was calling me exactly 1 day before his legal window expired, purely to ask for a piece of paper that would help him secure his own wealth. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I was surviving the winter without a functioning heater. He did not offer a single dollar to offset the funeral costs or the medical debt. "I have not seen any blueprints, Bradley," I said, staring at the heavy black binder resting on my desk. "I have just been cleaning out the dust." "Of course you have not," he scoffed, the disdain thick and heavy in his voice. "I do not even know why I bothered asking. I will just have my legal team draft a structural indemnity waiver. Look, just stay out of the way this week. The transition is highly sensitive and I cannot have you wandering around the property causing distractions." Before I could say another word, he added one final brutal insult. "And Sarah, do me a favor. If you are going to drive past the headquarters, take a different route. Your car is an absolute eyesore, and I have high-level executives arriving all week. I do not want them thinking we run a charity operation." He disconnected the call. I lowered the phone from my ear and set it gently on the table. A chilling absolute calm settled over my entire body. Any lingering trace of sisterly guilt, any microscopic fraction of doubt I had harbored about destroying his life completely vanished in that moment. He had been given every conceivable opportunity to show a shred of basic human decency. He had been given 30 days to simply acknowledge the sacrifice I had made to save our father's dignity. Instead, he had used his final hours to mock my poverty and protect his corporate image. The sun set on the 29th day. I sat in my small living room, watching the hands of the clock on the wall march relentlessly forward. I did not turn on the television. I did not read a book. I simply sat in the quiet dark, listening to the winter rain lash against the window panes, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. The morning of the 30th day broke gray and bitterly cold. The hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. I went to work mechanically processing payroll data, verifying routing numbers and tax brackets, but my mind was entirely focused on the ticking clock. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the traditional end of the banking day, my phone remained completely silent. No wire transfers had hit my account. No couriers had arrived with a certified check. I drove home and placed the heavy black binder on my kitchen table. I brewed a cup of tea and sat down watching the digital numbers on my microwave clock flip forward minute by minute. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 11:30. My brother was somewhere in the city right now, probably drinking expensive scotch, laughing with his arrogant wife, picking out the tailored suit he planned to wear to his massive acquisition gala the following night. He was absolutely certain he was standing on the precipice of generational wealth. He believed he had successfully shed the burden of his family and was stepping into a future completely free of consequences. 11:59. I placed my hand flat against the cool, textured leather cover of the binder, containing my father's secondary trust and my irrefutable financial ledger. Midnight. The digital numbers flashed to 1200. The 30th day officially concluded. The legal window permanently slammed shut. I let out a long, slow breath into the silent room. There was no grand explosion. There was no dramatic lightning strike. There was only the quiet, absolute finality of a legal mechanism locking firmly into place. My brother had failed the contingency of character test. He had failed our father. He had failed me. And by failing, he had just legally forfeited his entire kingdom. The shares of Jenkins Regional Logistics were officially voided. The multi-million-dollar corporation no longer belonged to Bradley Thomas Jenkins. It had just legally reverted to the owner of the physical land beneath the warehouse. It belonged to the woman sitting in the cheap suburban apartment drinking tea in the dark. I opened my phone and drafted a short, precise email to Attorney Sterling. The deadline has expired. I typed, my thumbs moving smoothly across the digital keyboard. No payment was received. The debt remains entirely unsatisfied. I hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital ether. Tomorrow night, my brother was hosting a lavish catered launch party at a luxury hotel downtown to celebrate the signing of the $12 million acquisition papers. He had invited me purely to rub his victory in my face. He wanted me to stand in the corner in my cheap clothes and watch him become a king. I closed my laptop and stood up from the table. I was going to attend his beautiful party. I was going to wear my best suit and I was going to bring a very heavy black binder. Bradley had demanded a clean exit, and I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. The trap was locked, the audit was complete, and tomorrow I was going to collect my inheritance. The text message illuminated the darkness of my small kitchen, vibrating against the cheap laminate of the table, where I had just watched the 30-day legal window permanently slam shut. The screen glowed with a notification from my brother. Come see what real success looks like. Below his arrogant demand was a digital invitation to the Grand Plaza Hotel, the most exclusive and outrageously expensive venue in the entire downtown financial district. Bradley was not reaching out to mend fences. He was not extending an olive branch to his grieving sister. He was setting a stage. A narcissist cannot truly savor a victory unless the person they despise the most is forced to stand in the shadows and watch them wear the crown. He wanted me to witness his coronation. He wanted me to watch him walk away with $12 million, completely convinced he had left me utterly ruined. I did not respond to his message. I simply locked my phone screen, finished the last sip of my cold tea, and walked into my bedroom. For the past 2 years, my wardrobe had consisted entirely of faded slacks and practical cheap sweaters bought off clearance racks, because every single spare dollar I earned went straight to the hospice billing department. I had dressed like a woman constantly bracing for the next devastating financial blow. But tonight was fundamentally different. Tonight, I was not the exhausted, terrified daughter begging a facility administrator for a payment plan. I was the sole legal owner of a massive logistics empire. I reached into the very back of my closet and pulled out a deep navy blue tailored suit. I had purchased it years ago for my first major corporate accounting presentation. I slipped the heavy fabric over my shoulders, buttoned the sharp, clean lines of the blazer, and pulled my hair back into a severe, polished style. I applied a bold red lipstick, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The quiet, compliant victim was completely gone. In her place stood a woman holding an invisible match, ready to drop it directly onto my brother's paper kingdom. I grabbed the heavy black leather binder off the kitchen table. It contained the certified bank records, the notarized hospice ledgers, proving my $88,000 expenditure, the forensic property map, and the overriding trust document drafted by Attorney Sterling. I held it against my chest like a shield and walked out into the freezing winter rain. The drive downtown was a blur of neon city lights and wet asphalt. When I pulled my 12-year-old rusted sedan up to the valet stand at the Grand Plaza Hotel, the attendant looked momentarily confused. My battered car sat in stark contrast to the gleaming silver luxury sedans and stretched black town cars lining the pristine circular driveway. I simply handed him my keys with absolute unwavering confidence and walked through the towering, revolving brass doors. The entrance to the grand ballroom was flanked by massive, towering floral arrangements that easily cost more than my entire monthly rent. I bypassed the coat check and walked directly through the heavy oak doors, stepping into a wall of warm, perfumed air. The sheer opulence of the event was staggering. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated smoothly through the dense crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and delicate, expensive appetizers. The room was packed with hundreds of people. Bradley had spared absolutely no expense using corporate funds to celebrate the sale of the very same corporation. I stood quietly near the back wall, keeping my distance from the bustling center of the room. I did not grab a drink. I did not speak to anyone. I simply stood still, clutching my black binder, and watched my brother work the room. It did not take long to locate him. Bradley was standing near a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture in the shape of a delivery truck, holding court with a group of older, sharp-eyed men who radiated ruthless corporate energy. These had to be the senior executives from Apex Capital Partners. They were the private equity sharks who stripped regional companies for parts, completely unaware that the man they were about to give $12 million did not even own the dirt beneath his warehouse. Bradley was in his absolute element. He was laughing loudly, throwing his head back and clapping the lead investor on the shoulder with practiced familiarity. He strutted across the carpeted floor with the unchecked arrogance of a self-made titan. Chloe was draped securely over his arm, wearing a glittering, floor-length silver gown that clung tightly to her frame. She was showing off a massive new diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. She looked like a queen surveying her newly acquired kingdom, whispering smug comments into Bradley's ear while scanning the room for anyone important enough to acknowledge. At the far end of this ballroom, sitting on a raised velvet-draped dais, was a long mahogany table. Two pristine white leather chairs were positioned directly behind it, facing the enormous crowd. A thick, perfectly aligned stack of legal documents rested in the exact center of the table, flanked by two expensive silver fountain pens. This was the altar where Bradley intended to sacrifice our father's legacy. This was where the $12 million acquisition would be officially signed, witnessed by hundreds of cheering, applaudant guests. The theatricality of the setup made my stomach physically turn. Bradley could never execute a business deal quietly in a boardroom. He needed a spectacle. He required an audience to validate his massive, fragile ego. Suddenly, the soft classical music playing from the string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped. A sharp, high-pitched ringing echoed through the massive ballroom as Bradley tapped a silver spoon against the side of his crystal champagne flute. The low, buzzing roar of conversation slowly died down, and hundreds of faces turned toward the center of the room. Bradley handed his glass to Chloe, smoothed the lapels of his custom Italian suit, and walked confidently toward the raised dais. He stepped up to the microphone positioned next to the mahogany table, adjusting it with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He looked out over the massive crowd, soaking in the absolute undivided attention of every single person in the room. His eyes swept across the front rows, moved past the buffet tables, and finally locked onto the back wall. He found me. He paused for a fraction of a second, a nasty, victorious smirk twisting the corner of his mouth. He had seen the sister he had left to drown in medical debt, standing exactly where he wanted her in the shadows of his magnificent triumph. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Bradley began, his voice booming effortlessly through the massive speakers. "Tonight is a monumental milestone. For 30 years, Jenkins Regional Logistics has been a staple of this community. My father built a solid foundation, but he was a man of limited vision. He was entirely content to stay small to run a minor local operation. When the heavy, demanding mantle of leadership passed to me during his final, incredibly difficult years, I knew I had to take this company into the future. I gripped the black leather binder so tightly my fingers began to ache. He was doing it again. He was standing in front of a crowd of wealthy strangers, shamelessly stealing my exhaustion, my poverty, and my absolute devotion to our father, and repackaging it as his own corporate brilliance. I knew I had to put in the grueling, sleepless nights to modernize our operations. Bradley continued, placing a hand dramatically over his heart. I knew I had to make the tough emotional and strategic sacrifices necessary for true corporate growth. It was not easy. Carrying the weight of a dying man's business while managing his care is a burden I would not wish on anyone. But I did it because that is what leaders do. We carry the load so others do not have to. A soft murmur of sympathetic applause rippled through the front rows. The sheer staggering audacity of his lies made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. He was claiming my sleepless nights in the palliative care ward. He was claiming the agonizing financial sacrifices I made while he actively ignored our father's phone calls and planned his luxury vacations. He was wearing my pain like a badge of honor to impress private equity investors. But tonight, Bradley's voice rose vibrating with triumphant energy as he gestured toward the executives from Apex Capital, standing near the front of the stage. Thanks to the incredible partnership with our new friends at Apex, we are taking Jenkins Regional Logistics to the national stage. Tonight we signed the final acquisition contracts. Tonight all of that agonizing hard work finally pays off. I raise my glass to the future, to unimaginable success, and to finally claiming exactly what we have earned. The ballroom erupted into thunderous echoing applause. Chloe cheered loudly from the front row, raising her glass high in the air. Bradley soaked in the adoration for a long moment before turning his back to the crowd. I watched him step behind the heavy mahogany table, pull out the white leather chair, and pick up the heavy silver fountain pen. He looked down at the massive stack of acquisition documents, preparing to sign away a multi-million-dollar company that, as of exactly 24 hours ago, legally belonged to me. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of silk gowns and the clinking of ice and crystal glasses. Bradley sat at the center of the raised mahogany table, bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. He reached out with an incredibly smug smile and picked up the heavy silver fountain pen. The private equity executives from Apex Capital stood right beside him, leaning forward with hungry anticipation. They were practically salivating at the thought of swallowing our family legacy whole. Chloe stood just behind Bradley, resting her perfectly manicured hands on his shoulders, beaming out at the crowd of hundreds of wealthy guests. It was the exact moment of ultimate triumph my brother had been planning for his entire life. He positioned the tip of the pen over the thick stack of acquisition contracts, ready to sign away a $12 million empire. I did not wait for the ink to touch the paper. I pushed through the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom with Jonathan Sterling walking right beside me. The thick wooden doors swung open with a loud, heavy thud that echoed sharply across the cavernous room. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously to see what had caused the sudden disruption. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. I was wearing my dark navy suit, and my posture was absolutely rigid. I did not look at the confused guests parting to make way for us. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the raised dais at the front of the room. Attorney Sterling walked with the calm, predatory grace of a man who knew he held the execution orders in his leather briefcase. Bradley froze. The silver pen hovered a mere inch above the signature line. His triumphant smile slowly melted into a mask of pure, unfiltered irritation. He squinted past the bright stage lights, trying to comprehend why his discarded sister was marching down the center aisle of his corporate coronation. He had invited me to stand in the shadows and watch him win. He had never expected me to interrupt the main event. Chloe leaned down and whispered something frantic into his ear, her designer jewelry glittering under the lights. "What on earth are you doing?" "Sarah," Bradley hissed into the microphone, his voice carrying a harsh warning tone that bounced off the acoustic panels. "This is a closed corporate signing. Security should have stopped you at the doors." I did not stop walking. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face revealed absolutely nothing. Every single hour I had spent freezing in that abandoned house, every tear I had shed over my empty bank accounts, every insult I had swallowed while Bradley paraded around in his luxury suits, culminated in this exact sequence of footsteps. I reached the edge of the stage and climbed the short flight of carpeted stairs. The private equity executives shifted uncomfortably, trading confused glances with one another. They were highly paid professionals who despised unexpected variables. Bradley slammed the silver pen down onto the mahogany table. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He was trying to project authority, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his rising panic. He motioned for a pair of security guards standing near the catering tables to come forward. "I said you need to leave," Bradley commanded, his voice echoing loudly through the ballroom. "You are embarrassing yourself, Sarah. You are drunk or unstable, and I will not allow you to ruin the most important night in the history of this company. Someone escort my sister out of the building." I walked directly up to the podium and placed my hands firmly on the polished wood. I looked at the two security guards approaching the stage and gave them a cold, piercing stare that stopped them dead in their tracks. Then I reached out and pulled the microphone slightly closer to my mouth. The shrill squeal of audio feedback pierced the room, forcing several guests in the front row to cover their ears. "I am not leaving," I said, my voice projecting clearly and evenly across the massive space. "And I am not embarrassing myself, Bradley. I am simply saving these fine gentlemen from committing massive corporate fraud." The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolutely paralyzing. Not a single person moved. Not a single glass clinked. The lead executive from Apex Capital stepped forward, his brow furrowed in deep concern. He looked at Bradley and then looked at me, his eyes scanning my professional attire and the heavy black leather binder I was holding against my chest. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" The executive demanded, his voice tight and demanding. "Bradley, who is this woman and what is she talking about?" "She is nobody," Bradley stammered, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "She is my estranged sister. She has zero involvement in Jenkins Regional Logistics. She is just a bitter, resentful woman who was left out of our father's business plans, and she is trying to extort me for money." I turned my head and looked directly into the eyes of the lead private equity buyer. I did not flinch. I did not waver. I carried the absolute certainty of a woman who held the winning hand. "Before you sign a contract for a $12 million logistics company," I said, projecting my words so every single person in the ballroom could hear them clearly, "you should probably know that the man selling it to you does not actually own it." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Chloe actually dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the polished wooden floor of the stage, sending sharp crystal shards and expensive alcohol flying everywhere. Bradley looked like he had been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The private equity executives immediately took a collective step back away from the mahogany table, as if the acquisition documents were suddenly highly radioactive. "That is an absolute lie!" Bradley finally screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure unhinged rage. "You are insane, Sarah. I have the legal will. Abernathy executed the transfer. I am the sole owner of the corporate entity, and you are going to jail for slander." Attorney Sterling stepped forward, smoothly gliding past me to stand directly in front of my brother. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, professionally bound legal folio bearing the embossed seal of Sterling Corporate Law. He dropped the heavy document directly onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed right on top of Bradley's acquisition papers with a loud, definitive thud. "You have a will, Bradley," Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant authority of a judge handing down a final sentence. "But your father had a secondary trust. And unfortunately for your current business endeavors, you missed one crucial clause." Bradley stared at the thick legal document resting on the table. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, chalky ghost. His eyes darted frantically from the seal on the cover to Mr. Sterling and then finally to me. "What clause?" Bradley whispered, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible over the microphone. "Your father was a very observant man," Mr. Sterling explained, turning to face the private equity executives, who were hanging on his every word. He knew exactly what kind of son he had raised. He knew Bradley would abandon his medical care and force his sister to shoulder the entire crushing financial burden of his final days. Therefore, Thomas Jenkins instituted a strict contingency of character clause upon the transfer of his corporate assets. Mr. Sterling opened the folio and pointed to the highlighted text. I watched as the lead investor from Apex Capital leaned over the table, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon. The investor was a smart man. It only took him a few seconds to process the absolute lethal nature of the trap. The clause clearly dictates that Bradley Thomas Jenkins inherits the corporate entity only if he fully reimburses the primary medical caretaker for every single documented expense incurred during his father's end-of-life care, Mr. Sterling announced, projecting his voice to the very back of the room. Furthermore, the trust explicitly states that the physical land beneath the logistics headquarters, the staging yards, the warehouses, and the corporate offices is not owned by the business. It is legally tethered to the residential deed of the old family home on Maple Street, a property that currently belongs exclusively to Sarah Jenkins. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. People were pointing at Bradley, covering their mouths in disbelief. Chloe grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, looking like she was about to faint. The reality of her vanishing luxury lifestyle was hitting her like a freight train. Bradley was shaking his head violently, his hands gripping his hair in absolute panic. No, he stammered, backing away from the table. No, Abernathy did not say anything about a trust. Abernathy said the business was mine. I own the trucks. I own the brand. I own the contracts. You own nothing, Mr. Sterling corrected him sharply. The contingency clause granted you exactly 30 days from the date of your father's passing to reimburse your sister for her financial sacrifices. You were required to pay the debt to secure your shares. Bradley lunged toward me, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. How much? He screamed, his voice cracking. How much was it, Sarah? I will write you a check right now. I have the corporate accounts. I can give you whatever you want. Just tell me the number. I opened my heavy black leather binder. I looked at the neatly organized pages of hospital invoices, penalty notices, and bank transfer logs. I looked at the mountain of financial terror I had carried completely alone while he was buying designer jewelry and sipping vintage wine. It was exactly $88,000, I said quietly, staring directly into his panicked eyes. $88,000 to keep our father from dying in a crowded public ward. $88,000 that I begged you to help me pay. I will write the check, Bradley yelled frantically, patting his suit pockets, searching for a pen. I will wire the money right this second. It is done. I will give you $100,000. I will give you $200,000. It is too late, Bradley, I said, closing the black binder. I spoke with absolute finality, letting the words sink deep into his chest. You did not call me to offer help. You called me yesterday to mock my car and ask for blueprints so you could sell a company on land you did not own. You failed the test. Mr. Sterling stepped forward, tapping the face of his expensive watch. The 30-day legal window to satisfy the medical debt expired yesterday at exactly midnight, he announced to the completely silent ballroom. Because the financial conditions of the contingency clause were not met, the transfer of the corporate shares has been permanently voided. Per the explicit terms of the trust, 100% of the controlling interest in Jenkins Regional Logistics has automatically reverted to the legal owner of the physical land. Mr. Sterling turned and gestured toward me. The entire company, the fleets, the contracts, the corporate accounts, and the headquarters now belong entirely to Sarah Jenkins. The lead executive from Apex Capital immediately dropped his pen onto the table. He looked at Bradley with a mixture of profound disgust and professional fury. You brought us here to buy a company you do not even own, the executive spat, his voice laced with venom. You completely misrepresented your assets. You are a fraud, Jenkins. This deal is entirely dead, and you will be hearing from our legal department regarding the wasted resources on this acquisition. The executive signaled to his team. The entire group of high-powered investors turned their backs on my brother and marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, leaving Bradley standing completely alone on the stage. Bradley sank to his knees on the carpeted floor. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the microphone and bounced off the walls of the Grand Hotel. Chloe did not comfort him. She stared down at him with a look of pure revulsion, before picking up the hem of her expensive silver gown and hurrying off the stage, desperately trying to escape the public humiliation. I stood at the podium looking down at the man who had tormented me, dismissed me and left me to drown in debt. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I had given him every chance to be a decent human being. I had given him 30 days to simply acknowledge my existence and share the burden of our father's passing. He had chosen greed, and his greed had finally consumed him completely. I picked up the black leather binder and tucked it under my arm. I turned to Mr. Sterling, who offered me a respectful nod. The psychological war was over. The trap had successfully snapped shut. I walked down the stairs of the stage and exited the ballroom, leaving my brother kneeling in the wreckage of his own arrogant delusion. The future belonged entirely to me, and I was ready to build an empire of my own. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the cavernous ballroom. It was the sound of a $12 million deal dying instantly. The executives from Apex Capital did not pause, they did not look back, and they certainly did not offer a single handshake. They marched out in a tight, furious formation, taking their massive wealth and their prestigious reputation with them. Bradley stood completely frozen on the velvet-draped dais. The silver fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered against the polished mahogany table, rolling off the edge and landing softly on the carpeted stage. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the terrified, shallow breathing of hundreds of wealthy guests who had just witnessed a brutal corporate execution. Then the spell broke and the absolute chaos began. The ballroom erupted into a symphony of scandalized whispers. The private investors, regional supply chain managers, and country club socialites, who had spent the entire evening aggressively flattering my brother, suddenly began backing away from the stage. They looked at Bradley not with admiration, but with the cold, evaluating glare reserved for a con artist who had just been publicly exposed. He was no longer a visionary chief executive officer. He was a fraud who had tried to sell stolen goods to one of the most ruthless private equity firms in the nation. Chloe was the first to react physically. The glittering silver gown that had looked so remarkably regal just minutes ago now seemed like a ridiculous cheap costume. She stared at the empty center aisle where the executives had vanished, her flawless face contorting from shock into pure, unadulterated fury. She spun around to face Bradley, her manicured hands curling into tight, trembling fists. "You told me this was guaranteed," she shrieked, her shrill voice cutting violently through the murmurs of the crowd. "You told me we were walking out of here tonight with millions. You told me I could close on the beachfront property tomorrow morning." Bradley reached out with shaky hands, desperately trying to grab her arm. "Chloe, please," he stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. "I can fix this. I just need to call Abernathy. I need to file an injunction. It is just a minor legal misunderstanding about the property lines." "A misunderstanding?" Chloe laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that sent actual shivers down my spine. "You do not even own the building we are standing in. You do not own the warehouse. You are entirely bankrupt, Bradley. You are absolutely nothing." She violently shoved his hands away, nearly knocking him off balance. She ripped the massive diamond tennis bracelet off her wrist and threw it directly at his chest. It bounced off his expensive Italian lapel and landed in a puddle of spilled champagne on the stage. "I am not going down with a sinking ship," she snarled. Her eyes filled with absolute disgust. "Have fun living in a cardboard box." Chloe turned on her heel and stormed off the stage, aggressively pushing her way through the parting crowd of guests. Bradley watched her go, his mouth hanging open in silent, complete devastation. He took a stumbling step forward, opening his mouth to call her back, but his knees simply buckled. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor of the stage, his tailored suit wrinkling as he slumped forward. The reality of the legal trap had finally bypassed his massive ego and taken firm root in his brain. He realized with crushing clarity that the multi-million-dollar logistics company was completely worthless without the land it operated on. He could not sell the delivery trucks because they were parked on my private property. He could not run the dispatch center because it sat on a foundation that I legally controlled. He had spent the last 30 days aggressively plotting a massive corporate sale, completely unaware that he was essentially a squatter on his younger sister's land. The $88,000 he had refused to pay out of pure arrogant spite had just cost him everything he had ever valued. I walked slowly back down the center aisle, moving toward the stage with calm, measured steps. The guests parted for me silently, offering me a wide, respectful berth. They looked at me with a newfound mixture of fear and profound awe. I was no longer the invisible, poorly dressed sister they could safely ignore. I was the silent architect of their host's complete destruction. I stepped onto the dais and stood directly over my brother. Bradley looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and overflowing with desperate tears. His immaculate hair was thoroughly disheveled, and his face was slick with a cold, terrified sweat. "Sarah," he sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand to grasp the hem of my tailored navy blazer. "Sarah, please. You cannot do this. I am your brother. We are family. Dad would not have wanted you to completely destroy me like this. I can get you the money. I will take out a personal loan today. I will give you $100,000 right now. Just sign the land over to the company. Please, I am begging you." I looked down at the man who had openly laughed at my poverty in a lawyer's office just a few weeks prior. I looked at the man who had ordered a burly security guard to physically throw me out into the freezing cold when I asked for a simple brass compass to remember our dead father. "Dad knew exactly what he wanted," I said, my voice incredibly soft but carrying the sharp, unforgiving edge of a steel blade. "He wanted you to show a single ounce of compassion. He gave you 30 days to do the right thing, Bradley. All you had to do was acknowledge the sacrifices I made to keep him safe and comfortable. But you could not do it. Your bottomless greed was more important than his life, and it was certainly more important than my survival." "I am sorry," Bradley wept, burying his face in his hands. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was stressed. I was overwhelmed by the corporate transition. I made a terrible mistake." It was not a mistake, I corrected him calmly. It was a calculated choice. You chose to let me drown in medical debt, and now you have to live with the exact consequences of that choice. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a crisp, heavy, folded piece of paper. I dropped it onto the floor right in front of his trembling hands. "I am not running Jenkins Regional Logistics," I stated, ensuring every single word landed with maximum heavy impact. "I am a payroll specialist, not a supply chain executive. Effective immediately, I am liquidating the entire corporate entity. I am selling off the commercial delivery fleet, auctioning the warehouse equipment, and dismantling the corporate accounts to extract the exact $88,000 I am owed, along with a highly generous amount of interest for the emotional distress you intentionally caused me." Bradley let out a strangled gasp, staring blindly at the paper resting on the floor. "That document is a formal, legally binding eviction notice," I continued relentlessly. "You have exactly 30 days to remove any personal belongings from the executive suite before I bring in a commercial demolition crew to level the building. You are officially trespassing on my property. If you attempt to enter the premises without my explicit written authorization, I will have you arrested immediately." I did not wait for his response. I did not need to hear another pathetic apology or witness another moment of his complete breakdown. I turned my back on my brother, stepped off the stage, and walked out of the grand ballroom. The absolute stunned silence that followed me out the door was the most beautiful melodic sound I had ever heard. It has been a full year since that night at the Grand Plaza Hotel. True to my word, I entirely liquidated the logistics company. It was a complicated, grueling process, but Attorney Sterling guided me through every single legal hurdle with brilliant precision. Once the commercial assets were completely sold off and the land was officially cleared of all remaining corporate structures, I listed the massive industrial plot on the open real estate market. A national commercial developer purchased the land for a staggering sum, firmly securing my financial future for the rest of my life. I did not sell the old house on Maple Street. I used a fraction of my newfound wealth to completely restore it. I hired professional contractors to fix the cracked foundation, replace the rotting roof, and strip away the decaying yellow wallpaper. Today it is a beautiful, warm, vibrant home filled with sunlight and completely free of the dark, heavy memories of the past. The heavy brass compass my father left behind sits proudly on my living room mantel, a quiet, polished reminder of the man who loved me enough to orchestrate my absolute freedom from beyond the grave. Bradley moved to a completely different state shortly after the corporate eviction. I heard through distant family acquaintances that he took a mid-level regional management position at a minor retail chain. Chloe finalized their divorce before the year was even over. We do not speak, and I have absolutely no desire to ever bridge that gap. I spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into a family dynamic that demanded my constant, unrewarded sacrifice. Now I take up exactly as much space as I want. I have found true peace, absolute financial independence, and a profound sense of self-worth that nobody can ever take away from me. To anyone watching this who has ever been made to feel like a burden, a scapegoat, or a bad investment by the very people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, I deeply want you to remember this story. Toxic people rely entirely on your silence and your willingness to keep the peace at your own personal expense. Sometimes the most incredibly powerful thing you can do is simply stop playing their game. Set your boundaries quietly. Gather your evidence meticulously and never be afraid to let greedy, cruel people walk blindly into the devastating traps they build for themselves. Your worth is not determined by how much you can sacrifice for others. You deserve respect, you deserve absolute fairness, and you absolutely deserve to protect yourself. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you a sense of quiet vindication or hope, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. I would love to connect with you all in the comments, so please drop a message letting me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Take care of yourselves, know your absolute worth, and I will see you in the next story.